Welcome to Minnesota Legislative Report, our region's longest-running public affairs program. Lawmakers from northeastern Minnesota are joining us today for a recap of the week's activities at the state capitol. This is your opportunity to call or email your legislative questions and have them answered live on the air. Minnesota Legislative Report starts now.
Hello and welcome to a new season of Minnesota Legislative Report. I'm your host, WDSE News and Public Affairs producer Greg Grell. Today's show marks the beginning of the 48th season of Legislative Report. No, I haven't been here all 48 of those years, but it is the longest running locally produced public affairs program in our region. This is your opportunity to call in with questions about the legislative session to the lawmakers that represent you. Now we have two phone numbers you can call locally. Dial 218-788-2844, or if you're calling from outside the local Duluth calling area, use our toll-free number, which is 1-877-307-8762. Now your call will be answered by a volunteer who will write down your question, and those questions will be brought to me here in the studio. Now please refer to the specifics of a bill when you call, not the bill number, because there are hundreds, actually thousands of bills introduced each session, and no lawmaker can know every single bill by number. The phone numbers and email address will be on screen for much of the program, and we'll get to as many of those questions as time allows for today. Now let's introduce the lawmakers who are here in the studio. Beginning to my immediate left is Senator Erik Simonson from Duluth. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Representative Mary Murphy, a Democrat from Hermantown, is here. And Representative Mike Sundin, also a Democrat from Esko.
Thank you for having us.
And we want to start out the season today just by giving people a little bit of an overview about what you specifically are working on. And Senator Simonson, I'll start with you. What are kind of your top priorities with this legislative session?
Right, so this is our typical budget setting session, and we've got a number of Duluth and regional projects that I'm kind of focused on this session. Obviously, I'm still serving in the minority in the Senate, so it helps to focus on local issues that are not controversial. We've got, of course, the Regional Medical Exchange District bill that we've been working on for 2 years. We hope to get that across the finish line. We've got the Duluth Sales Tax dedicated to streets. That's a really important issue for Duluthians. We've got a bonding project down at the deck for seawalls. We've got another project at WLSSD we'd like to get through. Some of that may carry over into the next session as well, but we're just primarily focused on local issues.
So tell me a little bit more about the regional medical bill. Is that the one for the big project at Essentia in Duluth?
Well, it revolves around two projects. One would be the Essentia project, and the other one is some of the work that St. Luke's is doing, but the Medical Exchange District encompasses both those hospitals and the surrounding areas. And really what it is it's an economic development bill. It would invest about $164 million of state funds into that area, and it's all about redeveloping the area that Essentia is vacating as they build their new tower.
Okay, and we may get some questions about that as we go on, but thank you for that update. Now, Representative Murphy, what about you? What are some of your priorities as we have our first legislative show of this session?
Well, the Democrats made the majority. We came in with 17 new people that were elected, and we became part of the majority. We became the majority this year. And so as a result, my tasks have improved, and the assignments are greater than they were before, because I am now a chair of a committee and a chair of the Legislative Commission on Pensions and Retirement, which is 7 senators and seven representatives that vet or consider all the public employee plans, retirement issues that come before us, and then we recommend changes in the legislation that's proposed, or we send a bill to the committees then that hear them in both houses. Mm-hmm. And so that's a responsibility, and I was elected chair of that at the first meeting this year. The other assignment that I have is chair of the Capital Investments Committee for the House of Representatives. And that the things that Erik talked about are House initiatives also, and will be considered. And almost every single representative in the House of Representatives, and there's 134 of us, have at least one project that has come before our committee that they say is has regional significance, and we certainly should consider that for funding. And then my principal committee that carried over from before is education, E through 12 finance bill, or bills, and I'm still on that committee. I'm not chair of that committee, but I am a senior member of that committee, and that is my most important focus for education throughout the state of Minnesota.
And we've talked before, you also chair the Ethics Committee. That's a committee that only meets occasionally if necessary, is that right?
That's correct, and we haven't met yet, but we are going to have a meeting in within the next 2 weeks, just to go over the rules and just remind people that there is an Ethics Committee, but no issue has come before us this year. It's difficult for an issue to come before us because one member has to charge another member of inappropriate behavior of some kind or another, and that doesn't happen very often.
All right, well, thank you very much. And now, Representative Sundin, you serve on a number of important committees yourself. What's kind of your priorities this session, and what bills are you working on this session?
I'm working on approximately 40 bills right now. As Mary mentioned, being in the majority, you get plenty of attention and you get a gavel, and you're a very popular person when people come with their bills and they want them to be heard and run through the process. So I'm a very popular person in the labor realm right now, and I've got a wage theft bill that is moving forward. It was heard first in my committee. It's not my bill, but I'm very, very excited to get that, give that some traction. I understand it's got some traction in the Senate as well, so I'm very, very excited about it. But just remind people we don't get to pick all the issues. You know, I mentioned 40 bills, and some of them are a little bit out there compared to education bills or bonding bills, that type of thing. But I do have a few priorities for my district there. There's a water line in Carlton. There's a Highway 73 improvements that I'd like to see done. And there's some tax issues that are moving through for Carlton and, Cloquet and Scanlon as well. So yes, we're busy.
I was going to bring up the wage theft bill a little later in the show, but since you addressed it, tell us about that. What is happening? What is the issue that you're dealing with that bill?
Well, unfortunately, some of the lower wage earners are easy targets for some unscrupulous employers. And I'm going to say 95, maybe 99% of the employers in the state are legitimate and great as far as the way they treat their employees, but there's that exception. And we have to protect those low-wage earners. And then in the construction trades as well, there's a misclassification of workers. If you're supposed to be earning this level in this category, that's fine, but sometimes people are misclassified and paid under what they should be earning.
And Senator Simonson, Representative Sundin mentioned the Senate has already got a bill dealing with this issue. What is there about this wage theft bill that you might be particularly concerned about?
So we heard this in the Jobs and Economic Development Committee, and it's a different version than the House. It's a little bit weaker bill. It needs to be improved a little bit, but we did actually hear testimony from employees that would come forward and tell us about scenarios where, you know, they would show up for work and they'd be asked to clock in, you know, an hour and a half after they arrived, and perhaps they would, you know, clock out for lunch, but they would be required to work through that lunch hour. So, and it's, again, I agree with Representative Sundin, it's a small percentage of the employers that are out there doing it, but it's something that we need to fix. And we need to give the agency the tools that they can use to enforce our laws and our rules and really kind of bring this back to where it should be.
And Representative Sundin, often it may be that a newer employee maybe doesn't know all the work rules and an employer is trying to take advantage of that.
Certainly that's the case sometimes, but a lot of times some of our immigrant workers down in the metro area, most particularly, and in other cities as well, because of language barriers, because of the unfamiliarity of the laws, they're easily exploited.
All right, we'll move on to some other issues, but remember, this is Minnesota Legislative Report, your opportunity to call in with questions to the lawmakers who represent you and get them answered right here live on the air. Now, Representative Murphy, tomorrow on Monday, House leaders are going to call a news conference to announce the committee budget targets. Tell the viewers a little bit about the importance of those budget targets, and is this kind of the roadmap now to the end of the session?
Yes, indeed, it is. It's the beginning of the roadmap because each committee, finance committee then, will know how much money they have to spend. And up to this point, we've been reviewing what projects and what things we should be spending money for and the needs of the people of Minnesota. And if we're going to have one Minnesota and include all people in all regions, we have to consider what projects we should put before the committees that are important to all that reflect on all Minnesotans. And so the target tells us how much we can spend for our committee. And our targets are different than the Senate's targets. It was early in the session that it became pretty clear that we weren't going to have the same targets. At first they talked a little bit, and it's really wonderful for the first time in a long time, certainly in over 4 years, that the majority leader of or the leader of the House of Representatives, the Speaker, and the majority leader of the Senate have met on a regular basis every week and agreed to some things that we can do together and some things that we can't do together. And at first we thought we would have the same targets, but apparently now the targets are going to be different. So what the House, for instance, the capital investment target for the House of Representatives might be $1.5 billion, whereas the lead Republican minority person on my committee is talking about maybe a $200 million bill. So there's a lot of difference between 200 million and 1.5 billion. And then the Senate will have a different number. And so the target gets us to a number from here to here, and maybe in the House of Representatives, it's a little far apart right now. But also, I would like to mention that another thing that affects the Capital Investment Committee is that the second bill that the governor signed was House File 80, which was a correction bill from last year that did not pass last year. It was vetoed because for the first time ever, the majority party used bonding appropriation bonds from the Legislative Commission on Minerals and Natural Resources that comes from the tobacco money or the pull card, the gambling money, and that's been used for natural resource kinds of things before, but never to replace GO bonds from the Capital Investment Committee. And there was over almost $120 million that was vetoed in that bill for projects for minority projects across the state that were being paid for from what they thought were going to be the tobacco money rather than the capital investment money. And so that I called that a technical correction that had to be made. Also, if you spend appropriation bonds, the debt service is millions of dollars more that you have to pay, that the state would have to pay, rather than GO bonds are much less in debt service payments. And so that was about a $7 or $8 million savings by changing the appropriation bonds to geo bonds and making the technical corrections that had to be made in that bill. And so that's already, we've spent in House File 80, or the second bill the governor signed this year, and it made the environmental projects legal and right and just, that were appropriated for properly. We've already spent $120 million. And so the $200 million that, or the $250 million that the minority might be talking about is already half gone. So it's another thing. Let me go on just a little bit more, because if the economy is slowing down, and obviously it is from what we heard last week, and the governor even had to go back on some of his possible recommendations to make. If the economy is slowing down, the best way we can address stability across the state is by investing in local projects, regional projects, and state projects that the state of Minnesota already has investments in, and HEAPR repairs and adjustments to buildings that are already there, and new projects that need to be renewed, or new projects that need to come on. But the institutions, the parks, the trails, the roads, the bridges, not trunk highway roads, but that's the transportation funding. But the other things can be done through the capital investment bill. Mm-hmm. And if we spent $1.5 billion, it would stabilize the economy in towns and villages and cities across the state, and the people could be ensured that there would be more jobs available to them, because that is real Minnesota's money going back to Minnesotans.
Senator Simonson, Representative Murphy mentioned that Governor Walz has kind of walked back his budget proposals a little bit because the surplus looks like it's going to be a bit smaller. Good idea. What do you think about what the budget is calling for?
Well, that's typical. I mean, the governor will put forward a budget. He's required to do so actually before the February forecast comes out. So once the forecast comes out, then the governor will typically adjust his budget proposal based on what the forecast is. And we now know, after seeing the February forecast, that what was once $1.5 billion surplus in the first biennium is now closer to $1 billion of one-time money. And then actually projecting out into the next biennium, if we don't do anything going forward, we actually have a very small deficit in the out biennium. So he's had to make adjustments to what his proposed spending targets are, if you will. But that's just one piece of the puzzle, right? Now the House and the Senate will put together their versions of what is an acceptable budget bill for them, and then ultimately that will get decided in conference.
Now, Representative Sundin, Representative Murphy mentioned transportation, trunk highway financing. One of the things that Governor Walz is calling for is an increase in the gas tax to improve roads and update roads, keep them in good condition. Many Republicans are against that. What do you think is going to happen? Are we going to see an increase in the gas tax, and how necessary is it, do you think?
I certainly hope so, and I believe it's critical. It's greater than necessary. It's critical to improve the condition of the roads and the state, and some of the state aid that goes to the county and municipal roads as well. It's long overdue. We haven't had increase in the gas tax in, I'm going to say, a decade or so. If you want to invest in your roads, fine. If you don't, you can let them deteriorate some even further. And that's simply not an option. There's two real obligations that the state of Minnesota has to citizens, and one is a uniform education system. The other one is roads for commerce. And after that, we do a lot of other good things too, far more than other states, but that's a critical piece. And most businesses are behind it, chambers of commerce are behind it, and we just have a few Republican naysayers down there that we're going to have to burst that bubble and get something going. Is 20 cents a gallon right away the answer? Maybe, maybe not, but we do have to move forward. I've always been a proponent of at least 5 cents a gallon up front, and then incremental increases for the next 10 years, maybe a penny a year, and make it predictable for our DOT engineers so they can do good work for us.
If the gas tax doesn't go through, is there a compromise, any kind of compromise that could help increase funding for highways?
Walk, don't drive.
Senator Simonson?
Well, I mean, this is a critical component of anybody's budget proposal, whether you're the governor, the House, or the Senate. This has to be considered, because the problem is that we've dedicated so many general fund revenues to transportation now to offset the inability to raise a gas tax for the past number of years, that if we don't do this now and raise that gas tax, we will not be able to free up those general fund dollars, which means we will not be able to adequately fund K-12, we will not be able to adequately fund public safety, we will not be able to provide the needs for our higher education institutions, and this whole thing is kind of built on a house of cards to begin with. So this is a really critical component in my mind.
Before the show started, Representative Murphy, you were talking about the gas price fluctuations you've been watching, and it seems like gas prices go up and down. It has nothing to do with taxes. So why do you think there's such opposition, since gas prices do fluctuate and go up and down, why do you think there's such opposition to increasing the gas tax by, say, 5 cents or 10 cents?
I don't know exactly. Just the fact that tax is a word that people put up a red flag in their minds right away, because they don't know exactly what it's buying, maybe, or how many miles it's buying, or most people don't have new cars, and their cars have to last a while, and every time you go to get gas, you know you're paying tax as part of that. And they always hear that Minnesota's a high tax state. And so if the prices go up, they think maybe that the taxes are going up at that same time. I don't know, but I did do my homework today, and in January, the first month of this year, I bought gas for $1.94 a gallon, 194.9, and I spent as much as $2.09 a gallon, 0.9, in January. In March, the lowest it's been is $2.44 a gallon, and the highest it's going to be if the gas is the same price in the morning as it was yesterday, it's going to be $2.69, and we haven't even raised a penny more. In the last 4 years, we have addressed transportation needs with one-time money, and that's the money that Senator Simonson talked about, that came out of K-12, came out of higher ed, came out of public safety funding, one-time fundings kind of things. We cannot continue that and continue to have stability and sustainability in the transportation.
Representative Sundin?
I think it's important to remind the purchasers of gas that gas tax goes directly into the trunk highway fund. It doesn't go to party hats for the senators or anywhere else. That's a dedicated fund, so there's certainty in where that money will be spent.
Always spent on highway, roads and bridges.
Yes.
And the guaranteed money that goes into that guaranteed fund that can't be touched except through the trunk highway fund, that money is matched in many cases with federal money coming into the state. And if we don't do our optimum spending in that way, we're losing federal dollars.
Are we in that situation now that we could be losing federal dollars, or as far as you know?
It has to grow.
Representative Sundin, while we're talking about gas prices, viewers might be wondering if the legislature ever looks at pricing practices, why the prices fluctuate, and is there any control that all the legislature can have besides taxes on gas prices?
It's kind of a wild west when it comes down to pricing gas. You know, they can fluctuate 20, 25 cents within the state, and that gas is produced by the same refinery. So we're at the mercy of some of the retailers when it comes down to the gas prices.
And I know consumers are often frustrated by that they can drive down the road and find gas cheaper in Esko than it is in Duluth, even though the gas came from the same refinery.
I was just going to mention that Esko and Scanlon are usually the most economical places to buy gas.
Good reason to stop by.
Stop by.
But once in a while, Brooklyn Center
Really?
has cheap gas too.
Right.
I know because I bought it there. Just look at my tank.
I believe you. I do believe you.
While we're on transportation, Senator Simonson, we've been hearing a little bit more about the Northern Lights Express, the railroad between the Twin Ports and the Twin Cities. Amtrak seems to be interested now. What's the status of that? What do you think is going to happen?
So Amtrak is looking at this very closely. They've been to Duluth. They've visited with a number of officials here. Had the vice president of Amtrak come visit me in my office. They are very interested in this model, primarily because so much of it is already built out. And I think that they bring something to the table that no one else can. If we were going to move forward with this project without a partner like Amtrak, this is probably a $500 to $600 million project, which includes the cost of the train and everything else, right? But some of the things that they can bring to the table in terms of equipment and the ability to build some of these stations out, we could probably cut that number in half and have this train up and running. Now, this train is supported by Duluth City Council, St. Louis County Board. We've been carrying the bill to try to get some state funding to leverage some other additional federal funds. And just tracking what's happening in Washington right now, it seems like there is perhaps an opportunity that their infrastructure bill may include some funding for this project. So between all three of those components, it's a possibility, and you know, a lot of the communities along that route see this as an economic development opportunity as well.
Representative Sundin, is that similar to what you're hearing?
Yeah, I've fielded some concerns from constituents along the route that property owners along the rail, and they're concerned about a high-speed rail running, you know, near their homes or whatever. So I did meet with the Amtrak people as well, and I posed a question to them, you know, how is this going to disturb people more or less? And they assured me that the upgrades on the rail and those trains are actually going to run a lot quieter. Faster, but a lot quieter as well. So I hope that brings some assurance to the property owners.
And Representative Murphy?
But it's not going to be high speed. It's going to be speedier than it is now, but not more than 90 miles an hour, I don't think. And we have to get the Grassy Point bridge fixed for it to work best.
Because the train is going to go to Superior and then back to Duluth.
But we're not sure yet.
Okay.
It's not a recommendation I have, but Speaker Hortman and I met with the same leaders that they met with, and Speaker Hortman is really solidly behind this because this goes from her community to my community. But most important, what it does, it connects us to Chicago. It connects us to Milwaukee. It connects us to St. Louis. It connects us to Las Vegas or Colorado. It connects with other things. And so it's not just between Coon Rapids and Duluth. It's all the other connections that come from east, west, north, and south. Well, maybe not north yet, but that's another phase. This is fourth phase.
Now, Senator Simonson, folks with long memories will remember that Amtrak at one time did serve Duluth, and the train ended up, not making it. They ended up having to shut down the line. What in your mind makes it more likely to succeed this time than it did back then? I think that was in the 70s maybe was when it ran.
Right. And I think it's important to recognize that most transportation systems have some level of subsidy, right? I mean, they're never 100% going to be self-sustainable. But I think this is a society change. This is where we're going. If you think back to the 70s, more people were interested in driving their own cars, and there was more cars on the road, and the idea of the train was kind of a slow process, and it didn't really meet the needs of society then. But things are shifting and things are changing, and younger generations have an interest in, being able to use that time traveling between Duluth and the metro, doing something else besides just looking at the windshield. And I think there's opportunities for tourism, there's opportunities for industry to use it, there's opportunities for commercial business folks to use it, and I think it might work.
And Representative Sundin?
Just to remind people as well, a lot of people try to compare rail travel with driving. We subsidize those public roads to the tune of billions of dollars every year, and just to reaffirm what the senator said, we subsidize everything at one point or another somehow.
All right, well, you are watching Minnesota Legislative Report. Don't forget to make those telephone calls, call in the questions that you may have to our lawmakers, and they'll answer them live here in the studio. One of the questions, or one of the things we've been hearing a lot about the last couple of weeks is a report about child care fraud. And we don't have anybody that serves on the right committees here, but would one of you want to talk a little bit about what that issue is all about and what the legislature is doing? Representative Sundin, do you want to start?
No.
Okay. Representative Murphy?
Well, more than child care fraud, that is something that there's a special committee being formed to look into because of a report that came out and in the Department of Human Services. And that's one topic, but that's not something we know a lot about yet because we don't know exactly where it was or what it was or how much it was. But the child care facilities, the counties of northeastern Minnesota and other regional counties across the state have been looking at the problem of child care. The kind of child care that's presented regionally is diminishing. And centers are growing up, and are replacing, in many cases, the home type of child care that traditionally has been the mainstay of rural Minnesota. But because of changes in life and so forth, as the home caregiver retires, no one is picking up. And now many rural people have the opportunity to have jobs, but they can't find child care, and so they have to, the economy is not growing because there's not proper child care. So the counties are getting more and more pressure to have centers grow up. And our area has made reports to the people now and has had many listening sessions on how to address that and have some proposals. And so are the other regions across the state. And there's a committee that's working, that was formed just for one of these reasons is there a different kind of child care that's needed in rural Minnesota than in metro Minnesota? And how do we see that the kids get the right kind of child care wherever? And people say, well, if you didn't have so many rules, grandma would still be in the business. Well, that might be true, but who wants to not have rules and have their kid abused in some way at some place either? So you've got to, it's weighing. Mm-hmm. Governor Dayton had an answer to it for a while, have 4-year-olds at school. But that was a threat to the centers and the home providers because the 4-year-olds, having 4-year-olds was the way where they could make their profit, because it's so tight for somebody that's providing childcare and what they can charge for that childcare. And so there's so many problems here. But it is being addressed, and I think there will be bills that will be passed that will make it easier and will be the first step, at least, to have statewide child care policies.
And both Representative Sundin and Senator Simonson have comments. We'll start with Representative Sundin.
I could see where we could make progress on this issue if we could incentivize somehow major employers that are, have hundreds of employees and they've got room for more employees if they had health care. If these businesses would invest and participate in and maybe provide child care as some type of a benefit for employment as well. So if they really want employees, maybe they should pony up.
And Senator Simonson?
I think this is a really important point to make. I agree with everything that was said already, but in addition, about a year ago, there was a report that came out by a television station down in the cities that did a story, if you will, about fraud in our child care system. And I think it was actually talked about $100 million in a suitcase going overseas to fund terrorist organizations, which is what prompted the OLA, the Legislative Auditor Office, to do an investigation. And the fact of the matter is that report is out now, and there's no evidence that that was happening, which is good. But it does point out that there is, certain levels of fraud, and that's somewhat to be expected in an organization that's that broad. And I think that the new commissioner is going to deal with that appropriately. But probably more importantly, the OLA has made the suggestion that oversight should be moved out of DHS and put into perhaps DPS or somebody with some enforcement background. So we get a little bit more people with a little bit more eyes on it, and we'll figure it out. But it wasn't what was reported a year ago.
It sounds like more information will be coming, and we'll probably learn more as the session goes on. Representative Sundin, one of the things that's being called for this session is an increase in local government aid, or LGA payments as they're called. That's under consideration. Why do you think that's important during the session to get passed?
Well, a lot of the municipalities are facing the same structural problems as the state as far as their roads and providing for the, let's say, the infrastructure needs of their communities. Water, sewer, roads, and they're squeezed pretty tight. Right now, I've got a couple of bills to provide local sales tax for the city of Scanlon, and we did a revision on the city of Cloquet as well, so they can build more roads and upgrade their sewer systems. They're willing to do it on their own with sales tax because there's not enough LGA. But that works well with communities that have, or counties or cities that have a real sales base. But there's a lot of counties, a lot of municipalities out in greater Minnesota that the money simply doesn't circulate that fast. And that sales tax base certainly isn't there. So some increases in LGA would be welcomed by almost every municipality.
And Senator Simon, that LGA formula, that's really designed to help balance the playing field a bit for rural communities?
It is. I mean, if you think about LGA and when it was first formed back in the 70s, the Minnesota Miracle, right? Mm-hmm. This was the idea that was meant to help the state as a whole keep local property taxes as low as they possibly could. And the program worked very well for many, many years. And if you remember when Governor Valenti was in office in 2002, 2003, he cut local government aid in order to balance the budget in time of deficit. Since that time, we've never been able to recover back to where we were prior to that cut. So this bill that's kind of gaining some traction and some popularity in both House and Senate and Governor's office would put about $30 million back into the formula and then include an inflator going forward so that we could get back to where we were at least prior to 2003, and then going forward it would continue to go up in small increments. And this would be, I don't remember the exact number, but it's probably an additional $2-ish million for the city of Duluth as an example.
Okay. Well, we'll follow that as the session continues. And Jim from Hermantown has the honor of getting the first question in for season 48, and he's got a question for Representative Murphy, no surprise. Representative Murphy, Jim is wondering, as a taxpayer, and these are his words, why do we always have to pay money for non-essential projects, but not for our infrastructure? So he thinks that too many non-essential projects are getting money over infrastructure. What is your comment about that?
I'm not sure what exactly Jim is talking about, but to one person something may be non-essential, or to another community it's absolutely a need. And so that's a big issue that we have when we decide, those of us that work on committees that have many requests for funding. Is this a need or is this a want? And I think Jim thinks we spend too many dollars on wants when there's essential things to be spent money on, needs to be for money to be spent on. And that's the most critical question that every finance committee has to decide on for their issues that are before them. And it certainly is a tremendous discussion point in the committees that, like capital investments. Is this a need? Is this a want?
Right.
But we need clean water. We need a good wastewater systems. We need garbage removal. We need roads that are without potholes. We need potholes to be fixed. We need many things. And other people might think, oh, that's just a want.
So it's in the eye of the beholder sometimes.
It's in the eye of the beholder, and those that have to make those decisions on, are we getting the most urgent needs taken care of? And that's the first item that every finance chair has to make sure of.
And Senator Simonson, you serve on a couple of different finance committees. When those questions come before you, that's kind of the point that you're looking at. What is essential?
Right. I mean, we hear a lot of bills. Many committee chairs will try to hear bills that anybody who takes the time to introduce. But at the end of the day, you really have to consider, with limited resources that you have available, you have to consider where we're going to get the most bang for our buck, right? And especially, in areas like economic development is a really good example. We will focus in on bills that fit within the target, that provide the most job creation opportunities, and that provide the best opportunity for the individual communities. So, and again, I mean, it's really up to each individual or each committee, each chair to figure out what those priorities are, but ultimately we want to make sure that we're spending dollars appropriately that will return themselves many times over to the state.
All right, well, you are watching Minnesota Legislative Report. Make your phone call right now if you have a question for one of our lawmakers. Representative Sundin, you serve on the Environment and Natural Resources Committee. Talk a little bit about what some of the important bills that committee is dealing with during this session.
I would say the water issue is paramount. Well, it should be. We deal with quite a number of everything from beaver trapping right down to water quality, and I would say the water quality issues actually are prioritized in that committee. So.
Well, last year there was a lot of talk about wild rice and discharge limits and things like that. What's happening with that this session? Is there anything imminent that's going to change, say, discharge rules for mining companies? Or
very little discussion in the committee on that.
Okay.
I will say that.
Okay. Senator Simonson?
So last year, if you recall, at the end of session, Governor Dayton created a task force. And that task force was convened, did a lot of work over the interim and into the fall, and then in December they issued a final report, which Governor Walz and the legislature have now received. As a result of that report, there are a number of recommendations in there. Primary recommendation would be to create an ongoing council, not just a temporary task force, but an ongoing council that will consider a number of these. The end result of the task force report was that this is an incredibly complicated issue. The science, in many cases, overlaps and is in agreement, but in some areas it is not in agreement. So the purpose of this council will be to kind of look at this issue holistically and try to figure out the best direction for the state to go. So we've put together a bill that's moving forward that essentially takes this task force report and puts it into law.
Representative Sundin.
I did have some productive discussions with the Fond du Lac tribe over in my district, and their biggest concern was to be at the table and be part of that decision making and weigh in on those issues. A lot of times they have been excluded from discussions, and I hope going forward they're included in all discussions.
Okay. We'll move on to an issue that's been getting some attention, Representative Murphy, and that's a hands-free cell phone bill has passed the House and the Senate is going to be considering it. Talk a little bit about what that bill says, what it would do, and why it's important.
I'm probably not the person to be discussing that, except that your hands should be on the
Steering wheel?
on the steering wheel, and you shouldn't be busy doing other things with your hands when you're driving. And that's the way most of the people in the House of Representatives felt and continue to feel, and there was over 100 votes.
Representative Sundin, did you want to?
Some states are take it far more seriously than the state of Minnesota. In Montana, it's a $250 fine. So don't do that in Montana. And it's very important. There's somewhat of an ironic twist in this. The chair of the Transportation Committee is Representative Frank Hornstein from Minneapolis, and he doesn't drive, but he's been a driving force behind this bill. So credits to Representative Hornstein.
And Senator Simonson, do you expect the Senate to follow suit on that or similar legislation?
I do. We're actually taking it up on the Senate floor tomorrow, I think. At least it's on the calendar for tomorrow. And the bill should pass with overwhelming support. I can tell you, and I'm sure that these two would agree, driving back and forth to St. Paul on I-35, I can't tell you how many people I either pass or pass me that are looking at that phone or doing things on that phone. And the testimony from the folks that have been affected by these distracted driving crashes, it's heartbreaking. This is going to be a challenge for law enforcement to enforce and to figure out how to do that, but I think this bill will pass with overwhelming support.
And what is it? Does it just call for bigger fines, as Representative Sundin mentioned, or what is the penalty?
I think that's the sticking point between the House and the Senate right now, is what the penalty should be, or if the penalty should be increased. It's I think our bill is a little bit lesser in that it just says thou shalt not do this. But I think we've got to put some weight behind that, and it's got to be able to change behavior, and sometimes the way that you do that is by increasing the penalty.
Okay. And Representative Murphy, you serve on the House Legacy Finance Committee, and wanted to talk a little bit about what's happening with that committee this session. And I know you are carrying a bill that's helping Minnesota Public Television, so thank you for that.
Oh. Yes, and they're asking for money from the Legacy. Minnesota Public Television is asking for money from the Legacy Fund as well as Capital Investment Fund. And they're asking for $15 million cash for equipment because GEO bonds cannot buy equipment for television. And they've always gotten their money through the cash route. Yes, the Legacy Committee is hearing proposals. We're celebrating the 10th year of success with the voters' choice from 2008, when the voters said that 3/8 of a cent should be spent for outdoor heritage, clean water, parks and trails, and art and education and history and culture of Minnesota. So those are the 4 funds, and each of the 4 funds are run differently. The Outdoor Heritage Council is a group of appointed advisors. The Clean Water Council is a group of appointed advisors. The Parks and Trails is a group of appointed advisors, and the Arts and History and Culture decisions are made solely by the legislature in the House and the Senate. And the House's process is different than the Senate's process. So there are many opportunities. But there was a celebration at the History Center 2 weeks ago in which hundreds of people showed up to celebrate the 10-year anniversary, and that millions and millions of dollars have been spent for the purposes that have gotten down to the ordinary people of Minnesota through those 4 groups, 4 methods for doing things in local communities and bringing people more in touch with parks and trails and clean water and outdoor hunting and fishing and grasslands, and it's just been a success. And but we are not basking in the success. We are continuing to see that there's more and more people that are aware of what could be done through these four funds. And the requests do not stop coming in, and the most exciting thing was the other night. A 10th grader from the Hmong community came and read a poem that she had written, and she wanted to testify that there is a need for a lot more opportunities for children of people that were not born in the United States to learn about the history of their ancestors. Mm-hmm. And could we help? And that 10th grade student made such a message to us that we ended up giving her a standing ovation. And so there's different people that are coming to request different kinds of things that the money should be spent on. And she thought that knowing about her ancestors was an essential thing that she had to learn.
All
so
right, well,
Jim, you know, our hearts are tugged by many strings.
We've got a call from John from Duluth, and he's got a question for Representative Sundin. And he's concerned about discharge from ships and how they have contributed to endangered species. And he's wondering why the taxpayers should pay for that. Why don't the shipping companies who cause it pay for it? He thinks there should be a loading and unloading tax for shipping companies that maybe have contributed to the species that are not native to our region.
John is correct in his concerns about the invasive species that come from the discharged water from the ships. Just to backtrack a little bit, if you take a look at the invasive species in inland lakes right now, the ground zero is actually Hennepin and Ramsey County because of the amount of people there. And then the invasive species that spreads into the lakes just spreads out from there. And we need to do better. There are programs in place. The DNR is working really hard on it at the state level here. I agree with John 100% as far as regulating the discharge waters. I don't know what the answer is, but that gets into international negotiations probably as well, and that's best dealt with at the federal level, which I would say right now, given the climate in Washington, fat chance, but he's right.
And we only have a couple minutes left, but I just wanted to give folks a little bit of a preview of what they might expect next week. Senator Simonson, what are some of the issues you think that are going to be rising to the top next week?
Well, we've got the hands-free cell phone bill up tomorrow. Beyond that, the committees are really focused in on deadlines, trying to get as much of that work done as we possibly can. Because once targets are released and we get past the second deadline, then those committees, the finance committees, will start to put together their omnibus bills. So you'll see a lot of work in committees over the next couple of weeks.
And Representative Murphy, what about on the House side?
Same thing. The targets should be known publicly tomorrow, and the committees are winding up their work with gathering information, and now we have to roll out our bills, and that's going to be difficult for some and not so difficult for others, but depends on how much money we have.
Representative Sundin, anything you'd like to add about the end of the beginning of the session next week?
Committee chairs in the finance divisions are going to be very, very busy here in the next 2 weeks going forward, and I don't envy them. We've got a lot of bills to be heard on the House floor, and it's going to be a lot of late nights, so stay tuned.
Well, I'd like to thank each of you, Representative Sundin, Representative Murphy, Senator Simonson, for being here today. We really do appreciate it, and that's all the time we have this week for Minnesota Legislative Report. Again, thanks to the lawmakers who took time to travel to our studio today. Join us again next Sunday on March 31st at 5 p.m. for an update on the legislative session. For the crew here at WDSC, WRPT, Public TV, I'm Greg Grell. Have a great evening.